What is going on, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. Today I've got for you the 4th episode in the Bat Crazy Betty saga. Now, I do need to apologize to you all because in episode 3 I left you on a quite frankly disgusting cliffhanger, but don't worry. Today we're back and I've got a proper length episode for you. It's just one post once again, but this one it seems, honestly, it feels silly to say this. It really does. But it is crazier than the last one. Like the last one, it involves a paragraph that will just blow you away. It's absolutely obscene. There's no doubt about it. So far, these 4 episodes is some of the most ludicrous content I've ever seen on Reddit. It might even be the most. It's insane. So without further ado, let's get into episode 4. By the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about, then where have you been? Subscribe to the channel, turn notifications on, and go and watch the episodes linked down below. I'll put a couple of thumbnails of them up on screen now. You've missed 3, but all these stories are about the same people. You need to go and watch and listen to the other 3 before this one. Let's get into this story. Prepare yourselves. Christmas with Bat Crazy Betty in Colorado, and it was a trash show. Hey lovelies, I'm back with another Bat Crazy Betty story. I just wanted to thank everyone for all your comments, concerns, opinions, and advice on my posts. It's been illuminating. I've realized that I failed to see a lot of red flags in my husband. What I thought was a perfect, happy marriage has cracks on the surface that go deeper than I realized. The biggest problem in our marriage is, of course, still Betty, my husband's crazy mother. I spent some time at work yesterday looking at online therapy services, but I'm going to try discussing it with Dan before committing to it. I don't want to blindside him with it and make him think that I believe he's not capable of making decisions. He's a good man and a great husband. He just has issues cutting the cord, so to speak. Betty is incredibly good at manipulation and has Dan believing that if he doesn't cater to her, he's abandoning her, using his father and sister as ammunition against him, saying they abandoned her and she needs him. His sister was stillborn. Oh my god, we didn't even know that yet. Wow. His sister was stillborn and his father, as we know, died from cancer. Oh my god, what? This woman gets worse and worse with every post. Betty is not alone, by the way, at all. She has family and close friends that she regularly sees. She just doesn't want to acknowledge that Dan is a man and her obsession with him is creepy and inappropriate. Anyways, onto the story. This might get long, as it was a series of unfortunate events that led up to a massive blowout. My parents loved Christmas but never liked to do big celebrations. Most of our extended family live far away in different states and they have busy lives, so it's not always easy to gather everyone together. If we did do a big celebration, we'd have to travel to visit with my grandparents. They're long gone now, but back then we'd go every few years. In the 2nd year of my marriage, my parents decided they wanted to do something different. Colorado is practically in the middle of everyone, so my parents rented a cabin and invited some of our relatives to come and celebrate the holidays. The cabin had 6 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms with plenty of space for a huge family. I was excited to have a little vacation with my husband. When Betty found out, she demanded to be included as well. My parents are good people, so they invited her. Much to my displeasure, as I already knew it was going to be bad if she came, but with some assurances from Dan, I let it go. On the morning of our flight, we ended up getting to the airport late because Dan had to go and help Betty with her bags because her car had miraculously broken down the morning of. It didn't, really. She just wanted to get Dan alone so she could lay down some rules about the trip. Her rules, you ask? They were ridiculous. She expected Dan to sleep in the same room and in the same bed as her. She demanded he show her around town and buy her whatever souvenir she wanted. He would have to sit next to her at Christmas dinner, and I would have to sit with my parents on the opposite side of the table. She wanted to open her gifts first before everyone else. Oh wow. And finally, I would have to stay away from them the entire trip and let them have their fun. Absolute idiocy. My husband told me he gave her the typical response to avoid an argument. Yeah, sure mum, whatever you want. When Dan came to get me, I had to sit in the back seat with all of Betty's bags because she just had to sit in the front seat next to Dan. I had to spend a miserable car ride listening to Betty complaining about her job and watching her reaching over to caress the back of Dan's head and play with his hair. He kept jerking his head away, but she kept doing it. She'd occasionally look back at me and smirk while she did it. The last time she did it, I snapped. "Stop touching my husband, you freaking creep." It was like a light switch. She immediately burst into tears, burying her face into her hands and wailing about how I was a horrible daughter-in-law for not letting her show her baby boy affection. Dan told us both to calm down, and we had to endure Betty's hysterics for the rest of the ride. When we got to the airport, she instantly stopped her theatrics and got out like nothing had happened. She smiled at Dan and told him to help her with her bags. She hadn't even been crying. Her eyes were drier than a desert. I don't think I'd gotten whiplash quite that bad from someone's sudden mood shift before. Dan helped Betty with her bags, and I had to carry my own. When we went inside, we were stuck standing in line, and Betty was latching onto my husband's arm while waving and grinning at strangers. Dan was looking uncomfortable. I was annoyed. I kept looking around for my parents, but assumed they'd already gone to the terminal. It took us an hour just to get to the terminal as the airport was busy thanks to the holidays. By the time we got our boarding passes, put our luggage on the carousel, had gone through security, and made it to the terminal, I was ready to drop. My feet hurt and I was exhausted from waking up early. I planned to pop a sleeping pill and sleep the entire flight. When it was time to board, Betty realized that her seat wasn't next to Dan's. She demanded I give up my seat, and I said no. We argued in the line, and Dan snapped and told her to shut up. She started whining and putting on the hysterics again. Dan and I were embarrassed as she was gathering an audience. People were staring, pointing, and whispering. Dan asked me if I could please give up my seat just to make her stop. I said, heck no, because giving her what she wants will just reinforce the behavior, and I wasn't going to just let her steamroll over me. He got angry and turned his back on me. When we got on the flight, Betty was still crying and demanding I give up my seat. She was making a scene, refusing to go to her seat and blocking the aisle. I was sitting in my seat, just trying to ignore her. Dan was trying to calm her down, but the more he tried, the louder and more absurd she got. A flight attendant had to struggle to get through the aisle, through the crowd of passengers, trying to get through, asking what the problem was, and then Betty went into how I was being mean and not letting her sit next to her baby boy. The flight attendant told her she needed to go to her seat or she would call the pilot and security to escort her off the plane. I asked the flight attendant to do that anyway, and Betty glared at me. Realizing she wasn't getting her way, she finally went to her seat, shoving past the poor flight attendant on her way. I was looking out the window and crying because the situation was ridiculous and it had put me in a horrible mood. Dan tried to apologize, but I wasn't interested in talking to him. We spent the flight in silence, but I could occasionally hear Betty berating the flight attendants for their poor service. When we got to Colorado, I rode in the same car as my parents, while Dan and Betty rode in the other. My parents were asking about the situation on the plane, and all I told them was that Betty was afraid of flying and was having an episode. They pressed me for more information, but I didn't explain. I just wanted to get to the cabin and take a nap. I was tired, hungry, and cranky. When we got to the cabin, I noticed some of my relatives were already there waiting for us. We exchanged hugs and greetings and went inside. I carried my bags to one of the rooms upstairs and laid down on the bed. Dan dragged his bags into the room and shut the door. We could hear Betty shouting for Dan, and he groaned. My father opened the door and told Dan to get a handle on his mother or he'd be sending her back to the airport in a taxi. Dan left the room and took Betty outside onto the porch. I cracked the window and listened in to see how the situation played out. Dan told her to stop with the behavior and overdramatics or he'd have to send her home. She tried to argue, but he told her to shut up and to listen to him. As if he hadn't just been telling her off for her behavior, she started demanding he move his bags into her bedroom so they could sleep together. He said no, and that he was going to spend the trip with his wife too, and not just her. She started crying, blaming me, and said I'd already ruined her Christmas for not letting her sit next to Dan on the fricking plane. He said enough, and threatened to call a taxi to come get her. She calmed down and sat down on the bench outside to pout. Dan came back inside, apologized to my parents and the rest of the family for the trip getting off to a bad start, then came upstairs to our room and closed the door. We got into bed and cuddled to take a nap. Goodness me. I mean, we're just a few hours in to the holiday year, and it's already absolute hell. Surely, like, everyone's just saying, you know what? I know it's your mum, Dan, but she's got to go. By 5 p.m, everybody was in the living room watching TV except Betty. She had barricaded herself in her room and refused to come out. Is she 3 years old is the question I keep asking myself. Dan tried getting her to come out as we were planning to go out for dinner, but she wouldn't answer. I said just let her stew and we got ready to go. We went to a nice restaurant and actually enjoyed a nice, quiet dinner. We brought her something, of course. We're not monsters. How I wish we hadn't, though. When we got back to the cabin, we found my stuff outside of our bedroom and the strong smell of my perfume. Betty had taken my stuff out and moved hers in. She threw my things over the freaking banister and it landed in the living room below. My Versace perfume that Dan had bought me as a Valentine's Day gift had gotten broken and spilled broken glass and perfume all over my stuff. My suede heels that cost over $300 were ruined. My favourite dress made of silk that was $100 was destroyed. We got into a heated argument and she said that Dan promised they could sleep together. Dan said he only told her that to avoid an argument so he didn't miss the flight. I told her I wasn't going to stand by and let her incestuous obsession with her son ruin my Christmas and marriage, and if she didn't stop with the BS, then she was going to be sent home in a van driven by men wearing white scrubs. I told her she owed me $400 to replace my dress and shoes because they were expensive, and I rarely treated myself to luxury things. Dan then said she also owed $150 for the perfume because she broke it when she threw my stuff. Betty started crying and wailing that I was the problem and that her Christmas was already ruined and she never approved of my marriage to her son in the first place, that I was just a female dog that only wanted his money. What freaking money? I work as a waitress, I still do, and Dan worked at a car dealership at the time. We made enough to pay our bills and Dan was working his way through medical school because it was what she had wanted him to do. I made more money than Dan did because the restaurant that I work at is very popular and I make a lot of money on tips, including my weekly check. When you break it down, for every dollar he made, I made 5. Throughout this whole argument, my parents and my family were witnessing the whole thing. My father's booming voice shouted over Betty's, telling her not to call his daughter a female dog and to stop disrespecting his family and that she was leaving. He had seen enough of her behavior to see that she is not stable and that she is a serious problem. He told her to pack her stuff and get out. Betty started crying even more, begging to be allowed to stay, that she was sorry. She was just trying to be closer to her son because she spent 2 years without him and she missed him. Now, one thing about my dad is that he is a big softie at heart. He melts when he sees a woman cry, especially my mum. He warned Betty that if she did anything else to ruin the trip, then she was gone. She agreed, gave me a check to replace what was destroyed, and Dan moved her things back into her room. She tried to test the waters and asked Dan to stay with her, but he said no and shut her door and came back to our room. We could hear her crying well into the night, but I was over it and wanted to go to sleep. Dan tried to initiate sex, but I wasn't in the mood and I just went to sleep. Christmas Eve was relatively uneventful. Betty actually made an effort to behave herself and seemed to be enjoying everyone's company. We played games, went skiing, and enjoyed lunch and dinner in town. We drove around to see all the Christmas lights on the homes, then went back to the cabin to watch Christmas movies, listen to music. Dan gave me one of my gifts early, and it was a beautiful diamond bracelet. I thought that Betty had finally cooled down and wasn't going to ruin Christmas for us. Boy, was I freaking wrong. She was just biding her time, thinking that everyone had gotten over her little show the day before. When Dan and I got into bed, he initiated again, and this time I was happy to. I won't get into the details, of course, but we had a good time, snuggled in, and went to sleep. Well, that's a shame. I was after the real gore there. Oh well, let's carry on. I got woken up when I felt a movement in the bed and a happy groan from my husband. Oh my goodness. It was then I heard Betty's voice ring out in the darkness. I love you, Dan. What? I quickly turned on the light and saw Dan snuggled up to his mum. I yelled and he opened his eyes and jerked away from her and we got out of bed. She was wearing one of my frickin' t-shirts that she must have stolen from my bags. We demanded to know what she was doing and she said she was making Dan keep his promise. I wish we'd locked the frickin' door. Oh my. I know I said in the last episode that I'd read one of the most crazy paragraphs of all time. Again, it's been usurped. What is happening? Dan grabbed his mum by the arm and took her out the door. He said he was not sleeping with her and to stop with the nonsense and go to bed. He shut the door in her face and locked it. She knocked on it for a few minutes, pitifully begging Dan to come to the door, but then left. I was freaking done. I told Dan that it was time to go no contact with her again. He agreed, but he said he'd let her have Christmas. I wanted her gone that very night, but I wasn't in the mood to argue. I went to sleep mad, and I was still mad when I woke up. The next day, when it was time to open presents, she pouted that she didn't get to open hers first. I made it a point to make her open hers last after everyone else because I was in the mood to be petty. Dan bought me a matching necklace and earrings and a dress I've been looking at for a long time. He bought her a pair of earrings, a gift card, and a new coffee maker that she wanted. My mum and aunt spent all day in the kitchen preparing Christmas dinner for everyone. The whole time I could hear Betty criticising their cooking and saying how she could do it better. My awesome aunt, being the petty queen herself, handed Betty the mixing spoon she'd been using and told her to have at it and that she was free to finish making dinner for everyone, so my mother and her could enjoy sitting on the patio, sipping hot cocoa with the biggest poop-eating grin on her face. I smirked. Betty stammered, then set down the spoon and said, "No thanks," and went to go sit on the couch. She started flirting with one of my uncles then, and he told her to shut up because she was disrupting his show. Betty tried to get Dan to come and sit with her, but he and I were busy playing poker with some of my relatives. By the way, this sounds like a phenomenal Christmas. Like skiing, going around looking at the Christmas lights, just having a great time, playing poker, your whole family being there. If it wasn't for this one woman, it would be unreal. Anyway, Betty sat there pouting the whole time, sitting with her arms folded and her lip poking out like a toddler. When dinner was ready, we all went to the table. When Dan came to sit down beside me, Betty grabbed him by the arm and tried to make him sit next to her. My dad gave her a stern look and she quickly let go. Dan sat down beside me and my parents. Betty did ask my other aunt if they could switch seats so that she could at least sit across from Dan. My sweet aunt wasn't confrontational, so she agreed without argument. Betty sat across from Dan while my parents plated everyone's food and passed them out. My dad's voice rang out over the chatter and told us all to bow our heads for grace. As Dad was saying the prayer, I felt Dan jerk. I looked up and he was mouthing something to his mum. I looked at her and she was smiling at him. I looked at Dan and he shook his head at me and we resumed listening to Dad's prayer. It was then that Dan jerked again. This time I looked at Betty and mouthed for her to stop what she was doing. My mother caught my eye and I noticed the irritated look on her face. When Dad finished the prayer, he said Amen in a tone that showed that he was annoyed too. While we were eating, we were all having mild conversation, asking about each other's lives. There was tension in the air, but we were trying to ignore it, as Dad was staring daggers at Betty, who was staring at Dan. Every time Betty talked, she would brag about Dan and compare him to everyone around the table. "Oh, your son's going to college? My son's in medical school. He's going to be a doctor. You work in sales? My son is a car salesman and makes great money to support his wife, who doesn't work." Stuff like that. He doesn't support me, by the way, and I do frickin' work. I'm pretty sure I've worked at the same place for the last year, Betty. I'm a waitress, remember? I said casually. "Oh, well, that's not really a job. That's like prostitution. You get paid for serving people." She actually said that, and my dad slammed his fork down onto the table, becoming angrier with everything coming out of her mouth. Dan told her that my job is a real job and to just eat her dinner quietly. She pouted and piped down. I noticed she was looking around to see if anyone was watching her. She purposefully dropped some of her food onto the floor and excused herself to get it. She crawled under the table and was hidden under the tablecloth. Dad and I looked at one another and I shook my head. I was reaching my limit with this woman's antics. It was then that Dan jerked again and raised up his hands and cried out while looking down at the table, "Mum, what the frick are you doing?" "Sorry, I couldn't resist," she giggled like a lovesick schoolgirl. I pulled up the tablecloth to see Betty laying her head in Dan's lap with a wide grin on her face. My father had finally had enough and stood up from the table. I half expected him to start yelling, but he kept his composure. "Dan, I'm going to ask that you escort your mother to her room and help her pack her things. I'm going to call her a cab." Betty heard this and quickly crawled out from under the table and begged my father not to make her leave. My father snapped. "Shut your frickin' mouth, woman. My wife and I have had to endure 3 days of this. Your behavior is inappropriate and unacceptable. You treat my daughter with constant disrespect and you make us uncomfortable with your behavior towards your son. This is the final straw. You are leaving and returning home. You are no longer welcome here." Guys, my father never cusses. He only does when he's really angry. Betty looked at Dan. "Are you gonna let him talk to me like that?" "Well, what do you want me to do, Mum? He's right. I think you need to do some serious soul searching because how you've acted this whole trip has been insane. Please go home. I will call you when I'm ready. Go, husband, go. Excuse me? She said. My awesome aunt replied, you're excused. Now go and pack your stuff and get the heck out. Betty looked at everyone like she'd just been slapped. She then looked directly at me. I didn't say anything, but I knew she was blaming me for all of this. She then grabbed a handful of food and threw it directly at me. I was hit in the face with mashed potatoes, green beans, and gravy, and I had figgy pudding thrown onto my chest. Dan grabbed Betty around the waist and started dragging her towards her room. My dad had to grab me because I tried to throw myself at her to fight her. Dan stood over his mum, making her pack her things while yelling at her about how unacceptable her behaviour had been. My father called the cab and stood guard at the door as she got in and was whisked away to the airport. I sat there crying as my mother and aunts gathered around me to comfort me. My father asked me if I wanted to get a restraining order, and I said I did. Dan, though, begged me not to, and my parents laid him out for it. Dan and I got into a heated argument that night, and I made him sleep in the room his mother had occupied for the rest of the trip. Wow. So Betty finally got her wish. I went to stay at my parents' house for a week when we got home because I couldn't even look at him without being angry. He begged me to come home, and I told him the only way I would is if he goes no contact with his mum. He agreed and sent her a strongly worded message. Mum, your behaviour at Christmas was unacceptable. You disrespected my wife and her family and disrespected my boundaries after I'd laid them out clearly to you. You need help, but I cannot be the one to give it to you. For the foreseeable future, I will not be speaking to you until you make an effort to get therapy and make some serious changes. I love you, but I've had enough. She never responded. After a week, she came crawling back begging for forgiveness and said she was going to look into getting therapy. She never made a promise to get it, but my husband ate it all up and forgave her. She never got that therapy. Dan accepted it. I was fuming, but decided I didn't have the motivation to keep arguing about it, as I was afraid I would lose him if I did. She never demanded to come on any holidays with my family after that, and refused to allow me to come to any, or birthdays, until a couple of years ago. Again, I didn't care. My husband and I worked things out and carried on like nothing had happened, rug sweeping the whole situation. I thought it was fine, but guys, you've helped me to see that sweeping things like this under the rug doesn't work, and I have years of built-up resentment for Dan and his mum. Just thinking about all this again has made me angry, and I think I'll stop writing for now. Until next time, I'll remember to keep watch over the clock to make sure I post on time. Okay, there we go. Wow. If you thought things couldn't get any worse after the first 3 episodes, well, you were wrong. So wrong. What have I just read once again? As I said halfway through that, it genuinely sounds like my ideal Christmas. Apart from the fact that my mum's trying to shag me, obviously. It sounded brilliant. But then it just got ruined by this horrible, horrible individual. Skiing, having some drinks with the family, playing poker, chilling out. That's unreal. Sleeping in your mum's bed. Sign me up. Apart from that, brilliant scenes. Goodness me, your mum has some serious, serious issues. I think the interesting thing to think about here is OP is posting all of these like sort of back to back almost every day at the moment. This stuff is, as OP said at the start, she wants to post in chronological order, and writing this stuff out is sort of making her relive these events in a way, I suppose. And yeah, now she's seeing the red flags, which is interesting, which makes me think, you know, what is going on now? How is their relationship now? You know, everyone involved in the story. We're going to have to wait and see. So subscribe to the channel and turn notifications on. Tomorrow, we'll be back with episode 5. But yeah, throughout all of this, you got to remember, these things have already happened. So I'm trying to just work out as I go what the situation might be like now. I think it probably goes downhill quite a lot. But anyway, as for that story, look, I don't even need to say anything. I think the story told itself. Absolutely insane. If you haven't seen episode 1, 2, or 3, I'll put episode 1 on screen here. Start the binge there. And I'll catch you tomorrow with episode 5.